You've probably felt at some point in your life the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Putting this out on YouTube and checking my dismal analytics, if anything, I feel like I'm not being watched enough. But modern life in many parts of the world comes with the expectation that you're being monitored in some way or another. Monitored literally through the use of CCTV and facial recognition software, monitored through your data use and contributions to social media. Or maybe you feel the pressure to take part in the kinds of self-monitoring on social media that are quickly becoming integral to modern economic success. This week, I want to talk about the idea of the surveillance society, drawing on a few real-world examples. But at the same time, this seemed like a perfect opportunity to take the chance to discuss everyone's favorite South Korean Netflix series about poor people battling to the death. Yes, I'm talking about Squid Game.
Yes, I gotta play the Squid Game. Yes, I gotta play the Squid Game. My only option is the Squid Game. Have a number, not a real name, 'cause I'm playing in the Squid Game.
Before I get into it, if you haven't seen Squid Game and you don't want some of the show's surprises ruined for you, I suggest you watch as much of it as you can before watching this. Some of the points I want to talk about are contingent on plot details from the show's climax, so get up to speed and come back. That being said, psychological tests suggest that spoilers are a myth, but let's get back to that later. Squid Game tells the story of Song Ji-hun, attempting to overcome his debts, repair his relationship with his estranged daughter, and avoid impending doom at the hands of local mobsters by taking part in a shady competition playing kids' games for cash. Of course, this comes with one huge caveat. If for any reason Song Ji-hun or any of the other 455 players selected to take part in the games refuse to take part, can no longer compete, or fail, they will be eliminated from the competition. Eliminated, in this case, meaning they'll be shot dead. While the plot is fairly familiar to anyone who has seen Battle Royale or even the Hunger Games, throughout the series there are numerous nods to philosophical ideas and comments on contemporary society that have elevated the show in the eyes of viewers. Several of these visual elements and plot points highlight that society today may have shifted towards what theorist and proponent of privacy David Lyon calls the surveillance society. To put it simply, a surveillance society would be a departure from classical theories of economics and social structures, as surveillance would play a central role in the generation of value and personal wealth. If you're part of the live streaming and TikTok generation, the idea of being watched as a very viable way of living could probably seem quite normal to you. However, as more of society is structured around acts of surveillance, it's important to consider how this could impact on human rights. The surveillance society can be understood as a production of three key ideas: the Panopticon, the Synopticon, and lateral surveillance. And luckily for us, all three of these ideas feature heavily in Squid Game. Analyzing the show through these lenses can help us understand some of the show's most powerful social commentary, but also help us to see how modern society places increasing importance on different forms of surveillance. Part 1. The Panopticon. First, I want to discuss the idea that society may be a panopticon or a panoptic prison. Squid Game's iconic first episode, Red Light, Green Light, uses the theme in an absolutely expert manner, foregrounding the theme of surveillance and the importance of privacy. In the episode, we're given the first glimpses of the player's dormitory, which is arranged in a way classically panoptic. It's in playing the first game that the show really spells out the preoccupation with surveillance. The first true game that Ji-hun plays, Red Light, Green Light, tasks players with staying still when being observed by the incredibly creepy statue of a little girl, while moving towards a finish line when its back is turned. However, if caught by the statue's motion detectors, players are shot dead by sniper rifles mounted in the arena's walls. While not exactly the same, elements of Squid Game's Red Light, Green Light resonate with the idea of the Panopticon or Panopticonic prison, originally formulated by one Jeremy Bentham, a philosopher with dangerously optimistic ideas about the malleability of human nature, whose creepy stuffed body can be found in University College London. Bentham envisaged the prison as an all-seeing place, where prisoners could be watched from a central viewing position, equipped with a searchlight that prevented prisoners from watching back. Importantly, the prisoners would not know when they're being watched for sure, so eventually they would act as if they were being watched all the time. This would, in time, bring an end to social deviance, as prisoners would recognize that it's just easier to be on good behavior than to keep taking chances and to try to figure out whether or not they're being watched. Or so Bentham hoped. Luckily for humanity, the system was never adopted within Bentham's lifetime and never became a norm that he hoped it would be. It's worth noting panopticonic prisons have been built, such as the Presidio Modelo in Cuba, operational from 1926 to 1968. However, just in case you're wondering, no, it didn't work. While in Squid Game, the Panopticon idea is taken to an absolute extreme, the mechanism of being watched constantly and punished for stepping out of line works almost exactly as Bentham hoped. By the end of the game, all of the remaining players have internalized the concept and play the game dutifully, even in one case, helping each other to succeed. The rest of the show continues to play with this concept of being watched. Indeed, in the first episode, the notion that there are figures doing the watching is confirmed, as the audience are shown a giant central monitoring center full of high-tech cameras. As the games go on, players become increasingly aware of the extent to which they're being watched, and frequently speak in the vague direction of the walls and ceiling in order to get the attention of the observers that they can only assume are still paying attention. As the show continues and the players internalize the conditions of surveillance, Squid Game increasingly calls to mind the writings of Michel Foucault, who developed Bentham's ideas for an actual prison into a social theory that suggests modern societies have developed rational means of ordering society that effectively dispense with traditional methods like brutal public punishment. Rather than relying on external controls and constraints, modern social institutions employ a range of disciplinary practices which ensure that life continues in a regularized, patterned way. From army drill to school uniforms, and from social welfare casework to the closely scrutinized factory workers' tasks. It's important here to reflect on how Squid Game uses elements of school life to enforce behaviors. There are numerous social ideas that can be brought up here, such as the hidden curriculum of obedience and social conformity that is implicitly taught in schools. In this way, the game comes to take on a form of social order that the players increasingly accept. While Squid Game is a fantasy and may seem entirely unbelievable, the conditions of living it depicts are potentially not all that far-fetched. For instance, we can consider how the use of smart CCTV has been used in the United States and the United Kingdom since at least 2001, along with the ethical questions that have cropped up around these practices concerning the potential for errors, racial profiling in the case of false positives, and how this affects personal privacy. One particularly chilling case took place in 2018 in a police experiment in central London. 3 people were arrested for covering their faces even though they never gave consent to be part in a police-run experiment. Similarly, we can look beyond the US and the UK to discover how real-time facial recognition technology has been used in conjunction with closed-circuit television and the digital networks as part of the Chinese social credit system. Of particular note is how this technology is being implemented in the Xinjiang region for the policing of the Uyghur indigenous people. While it's perhaps unwise to completely trust Western news outlets reporting on Chinese policy due to potential biases, particularly given the political and economic tensions between China and the West, the increasing number of reports do suggest a strong possibility of human rights violations, at the very least on par with those in the West, and the reliance of surveillance technology as a part of these. Indeed, looking at some of the footage from Squid Game, there are some disturbing resemblances between how the motion detection system tracks players in the fictional series and on how these systems are reported in news media. We see the same numerical identification systems and same reliances on faces alone as part of a means of identification. Squid Game is a good reminder of the existing technology that is used to surveil the average public. CCTV and facial recognition software are commonly used, and they're frequently used in both the series and real life. The suggestion here might be that we are living in a society that is more in common with the Panopticonic prison than we might initially assume. However, it's also worth noting that the players are not taking part in the game solely for the implicit reasons alone. Part 2. The Synopticon. At the heart of the competition is the lure of winning 45 billion won, about 27 million pounds, or in more concrete terms, about 1/8,000th of a Jeff Bezos. Jeffrey Bezos. The money is kept in a huge piggy bank, illuminated in gold light at the center of the dormitory, and serves as a constant reminder of what the participants are struggling for. This, of course, is different to the purely conditioned societal and social order of Bentham and Foucault, as players aren't conforming solely out of fear. The show makes it abundantly clear that players are taking part in the game for their own accord. They even have the option to leave at any time, in the case of a majority vote, as happens at the beginning of the second episode. As such, money is playing at least equal, if not more of a role in their decision to compete. Given that players of Squid Game chose to be there on the basis of a financial reward, I might go so far as to say players of Squid Game are being seduced by the promise of a better life. This is right in line with what Thomas Matheson and Zygmunt Bauman referred to as the Synopticon, a reworking of Foucault's view of society, the many being observed by the few, into a vision of the few being watched by the many. Bauman writes, within the Synopticon, spectacle takes the place of surveillance, without losing any of the disciplining power of their predecessor. Obedience to standards, a pliable and exquisitely adjustable obedience to eminently flexible standards, let me add, tends to be achieved nowadays through enticement and seduction rather than by coercion. And it appears that the disguise of the exercise of free will rather than revealing itself as an external force. This, if anything, is probably more in line with our everyday experience of life, at least in as it pertains to parts of the world. Rather than living a certain way out of fear of prosecution that awaits should we befall the wrath of an advanced artificial intelligence system connected with a network of CCTV, we do TikTok challenges and apply filters to our Instagram photos in the vague hope that our conforming to expectations will result in financial rewards. Rather than posting whatever we like, we attempt to categorize using hashtags and other markers in a form of data-driven self-reporting. We even go so far as to tag our locations, times of posting, and links to our posts to private accounts with data about ourselves. This, of course, has resulted in the enormous fortune of data-driven corporations like Facebook, Google, and to an extent, even corporations better known for their hardware and software like Microsoft and Apple. Data has become the new oil in many ways, and is treated like a sacred commodity. However, unlike the control center in Squid Game, where the technology generates data through the use of technology, much of the data we create has been created voluntarily in the hope of achieving the oft-touted but little experienced influencer success. Just like in Squid Game, we know that the odds are stacked against us, and that the spoils will only go to a very few players of the game. But still, we take part, participating in a society that can only reward very few participants. So maybe the players of Squid Game and the members of society play their respective games out of fear, like the members of a panopticonic prison. Or maybe they take part because they think there might be a reward in this, even if the chances are incredibly small. But this, of course, leads to the uncomfortable truth that we might not be participating in the game out of fear, or out of the chance of a reward. So there's a chance that we're playing for some other reason entirely. Part 3. Lateral surveillance. Indeed, by the end of the show, Ji-hoon elects to no longer take the prize money and instead wishes to stop playing the game. In the final one-on-one showdown, rather than taking the life of his childhood friend, he elects to throw the game open to democracy once again in the hope that both he and Cho Sang-woo can escape together. This is a pattern we saw develop elsewhere in the show, as several characters choose to play the game even though their chances of winning are slim or none. Reflecting on this, we can draw on Mark Andrejevic's concept of lateral surveillance, or the process of peer-to-peer information gathering where friends, family, and external networks report on one another in a process that recalls the activities of corporate marketing and promotion. Rather than facing pressure from the top down, we take part in a web of surveillance that has no central power, but is rather self-sustaining, powered by our suspicions of one another. To that end, we might look to something like the recent phenomenon of cancel culture. Although the practice has its roots in the initially positive and empowering Me Too and Time's Up movements, which sought greater recognition of the misogyny and abuse prevalent in Hollywood through social media, there have been several cases where this has crossed a line from seeking to empower into a witch hunt, with no room for dialogue. For a longer discussion on this, I urge you to watch the YouTube essay by ContraPoints on the subject. But in short, once groups have begun to excessively monitor each other's behaviour, eliminating the room for nuanced differences in opinion, a form of tribalism emerges in which group members are viewed as either conformers or non-conformers. Recent debates over vaccinations, and before that Brexit, have left little room for nuance and opened the door for friends and family to become suspicious of one another in spite of their connections in real life. We can see this take place in one of the later scenes of Squid Game, where Ji-hun, Song-woo, and Se-byuk, in spite of having bested the competition, can't eat a meal in peace or sleep in the same room as one another because of their heightened suspicion of each other. Under each other's gaze, they behave in a way that only seems permissible, doing very, very little while keeping knives close to their chest. Yet, perhaps nothing typifies this behavior more than the participation of Oh Il-nam, the doddering old man who is revealed by the show's ultimate twist to have been the central antagonist all along. Not a penniless and senile pensioner, but actually an endlessly wealthy billionaire, Il-nam chooses to participate in the games because, as he says,
하는 것보다 더 재미있을 수가 없지.
watching can never be as fun as taking part. To that end, we are left with Squid Game's most powerful and frightening conclusion, that breaking free of the cycle of surveillance and reportage might not be possible, as no matter how rich or successful you are at the mercy of the many and will desire to take part in their activities even if you aren't. We could equate this to the seemingly endless and baffling activity of Elon Musk and Donald Trump on social media. These powerful moguls' direct communication and participation in the lives of those several million less dollars wealthy than themselves is entirely resonant with Il-nam's desire to play the Squid Game, even though he has no need to. What we're left with is the idea of a form of surveillance that is so all-encompassing as to become a form of life in its own right. It's hard not to feel like no matter how much money you make or how much money you lose, you cannot be free from the literal technology of surveillance, the aspiration to self-surveil in the hope of receiving compensation, or the surveillance of your friends and family. But what do you think? Is surveillance a part of society now? Or is there more to life? Well, be sure to let me know in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.